Hello, my name is Jim Hadley, and at the beginning of each of these 10-part programs, I'd like to just give you a little bit of an idea about the point of view from which I approach the subject matter. Museums like this display what are called, in the most general sense, works of art. But what gives a work of art its value? Why do we put it in a place like this? If you're familiar with the typical art history text, you've been led to believe that what's most important, what's most valuable about a work of art is what it looks like. Art historians try to convince us of this by talking above all else about things like dramatic intersecting diagonals, monumental groupings, lines, forms, and so on. Sometimes this kind of language can be pretty far from useful, however. Take this example from Bruce Cole and Adelheid Galt's book, Art of the Western World. Rationality and irrationality are woven together as line defines volume here and denies its existence there, as gold implies space in one spot and affirms a flat surface in another. Irreconcilable differences somehow coexist here. Would you say that this description fits this picture? Sounds like it could to me, but in fact, it's a description of this 14th century enunciation by Simone Martini. Maybe this is a little unfair of me, but only a little. I can just imagine Bruce Cole or, say, Kenneth Baker trying to describe a man who'd robbed him to the police. They'd never catch the guy. But the real point I want to make isn't that the language of art historians is often more likely to produce puzzlement or laughter than insight. The point I want to make is rather simply just that this kind of language leads us to concentrate on appearances. This is a problem because when art historians leave their books, as it were, and come out in the real world, it sometimes seems as though what a work of art looks like counts for almost nothing at all. For example, the New York Metropolitan Museum used to have what was supposed to be an ancient Egyptian bronze cat on display. It was one of the most popular items in the museum until it was discovered to be a forgery and immediately removed. Not because of anything connected with its appearance, but because it was made using a technique unknown to ancient Egyptian artists. The Rembrandt Research Committee is currently providing many relevant examples of this sort of thing. These fellows are trying to establish which alleged Rembrandts are actual Rembrandts. The Berlin Museum's Man with a Golden Helmet here is one of the relatively few well-known pictures formerly attributed to Rembrandt to be reattributed by them, and it is one of the relatively few quondam Rembrandts, whether well-known or not, still on display, although it too has been demoted from what Steve Martin calls Rembrandt wow to Rembrandt yeah right. Of the 12 alleged Rembrandts, for example, that the RRC says are not Rembrandts in the Washington National Gallery, only one is still on display at all, yet not one looks any different than it did before the RRC's investigations. We didn't see any headlines that read, say, Rembrandt found with diagonals that no longer intersect. Copies of Dürer engravings, indistinguishable from the original to the naked eye, are available to anyone with a nickel for a Xerox machine, while the originals are valued as great works of art. How can this be explained if the appearance of a work of art is the main thing that makes it valuable to us? What these kinds of cases illustrate is that there is a radical inconsistency in the way art historians do business. What is valuable about a work of art is obviously something much more complex than just what it looks like. We don't have time to go into this in a lot of detail here, but I think the most important factor determining the value of works of art, at least of the sort that get into art history texts, is what we might call their evocative power. Consider this case. Suppose you have a picture on your desk which you think is a portrait of you drawn by your daughter when she was 6. And then one day your now grown daughter comes in and says, Dad, I have a confession to make. You know that picture on your desk that you think is a portrait of you by me at the age of 6? Well, Dad, I didn't draw that. Remember little Betty Kowalski down the street? She drew it, and it's not you at all, Dad. It's supposed to be Paul McCartney. You might still keep the picture around, put it in the bottom drawer of your desk, sort of your equivalent to the depot where the Washington National Gallery stores its pseudo Rembrandts, but your attitude to it has changed entirely. Not because anything about its appearance has changed, but because its evocative power has changed. Now, to an art historian, Rembrandt is practically like a member of his own family, and when something thought to represent him is found to be false, this changes his whole attitude to the work, regardless of the fact it still looks the same. But for the evocative power of works of art to affect us, for them to serve as the exalted souvenirs of the whole cultural contexts out of which they come, we have to be familiar with those contexts. We need to know about their subjects, the subjects of the works of art, and about religion, politics, the other arts like literature and music, the whole cultural package, if works of art are going to be anything more than collections of dramatic intersecting diagonals and monumental groupings, lines defining volume and colors implying space in one spot and a flat surface in another. This way of approaching the history of art tends to blur the distinction between works of art and historical artifacts, as they might be called, between things like, say, the Mona Lisa and things like, to take an extreme case, and I emphasize extreme, Napoleon's toothbrush on display in the Carnavalet Museum in Paris. And different as the interest we take in the one may seem from the interest we take in the other, in this pair of extreme examples, their value to us comes ultimately from a common source, their evocative power. In fact, almost anything old enough or evocative enough comes to be treated like a work of art, whether it was meant to be one or not. In the end, and I think this is an important point, history itself comes to take on much the quality of a work of art, in which we judge events not so much by moral standards, but by whether or not they are interesting or enlightening or moving. A sort of corollary to this is that something that didn't happen, like the Trojan War, can have much more importance than lots of things that really did happen, and Odysseus and Hamlet can be as important as Henry VIII and Napoleon. This may also seem like a rather extreme position at this point, but I think what I mean will eventually be both clear and persuasive if you stick with these lectures long enough. The general purpose of the lectures, then, is just to tell enough of the story of the Euro-Mediterranean chapter of this whole unfaded and substantial pageant that is sometimes called the history of civilization, to allow us to increase our appreciation of the value of the souvenirs of it that we have, whether they are works of art, music, literature, battlefields, buildings, tombs, or toothbrushes. Eh bien, mes amis, à l'affaire. So this is the first lecture in the Northern Renaissance series, and what I'd like to do first here is just give you a little bit of an overture, a preview of coming attractions, so to speak, that will give you an idea of what we'll be covering this quarter.
This is the Chateau d'Anjony in south-central France.
Many of the most impressive things we'll see, especially early on, will be buildings this quarter. Architecture is the art form of the Middle Ages, and since we're really starting here in the 13th century, we'll still be in the Middle Ages, according to the way that period is often defined anyway, for a couple of lectures at least. One can argue that buildings can be the most evocative of all cultural souvenirs. You can go right inside them and pretty much step back into another century, as you can at Penshurst in England, of which this is the Great Hall. Often buildings we see will be interesting not just as works of art, but also because of the people who lived in them. In this case, Philip Sidney, the great poet and friend of Queen Elizabeth. The Gothic age is ending by this time, but in England many of the finest Gothic buildings, like this one, King's College Chapel at Cambridge, come at the end of the period, so we'll still be seeing a lot of fine ecclesiastical buildings this quarter. This is the place of which Wordsworth said that it's an immense and glorious work of fine intelligence, with roof self-poised and scooped into 10,000 cells, where light and shade repose and music dwells. And we will hear a lot of things this quarter that will, I hope, broaden your musical experience, because even if you listen to KDFC, which passes for a classical music station today, You don't hear much music written before Bach's day, and everything we hear this quarter will be, of course, pre-Bach. When you think of the Renaissance, though, without qualification, the first thing to come to mind is probably painting, and this is the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck, which Thomas Hoving, for what his opinion is worth, calls the most perfect, profound, moving, and exciting work in the history of art. Goethe calls it the keystone in the history of art. I like to think that every work of art, and a fortiori one as complex as this, is really a whole art gallery in itself, and we'll often see lots of details from things like this. This is a close-up of part of that altarpiece. Some cold art historians insist that astonishment is not a proper aesthetic response, but it's a natural enough one to most of us confronted with a thing like this, only about the size of a postcard in the original. This is the sort of thing that Kenneth Clark says looks like it was painted by insects. You have to be careful about generalizing concerning the nature of art in any style or period, however. We'll also see things like this picture of hell from Hieronymus Bosch's Garden of Delights triptych, about as different as it could be in spirit from Van Eyck's work. This was actually painted about the time Michelangelo was doing the Sistine Chapel ceiling, to make maybe an even more amazing comparison. We usually get to Bosch about Halloween, which seems appropriate. This is Albrecht Dürer's Night, Devil, and Death. The Northern Renaissance also produces in Dürer a man we might think of as one of the first great graphic artists, and who was, of course, also a great painter, but who was the first great printmaker and dessinateur. He made drawings and watercolors as finished works of art. And a lot of people find things like this easier to appreciate than those which are maybe more monumental. So we'll hear a lot about these and many other painters this quarter, but the Northern Renaissance doesn't produce many important sculptors. One of the most important is one of the earliest, Klaus Schluter, who was in part responsible for the tombs of the Dukes of Burgundy, which you can see here in the Ducal Palace Museum in Dijon now. Despite what some art historians would have you believe, not every age and place produces great geniuses in all the arts. We won't hear about any native-born English painter or sculptor this quarter. We will hear a lot about politics and war, and this is the battlefield of Bannockburn, where Robert the Bruce defeated the English in 1314. We'll hear all about the 100 Years' War and the Wars of the Roses, and see the battlefields of Crécy and Agincourt. We'll see Bosworth Field, where Richard III wanted to trade his kingdom for a horse. This is the statue of Martin Luther in Worms now, and we'll also hear a lot about religion and the Reformation, and this is where Luther met with Charles V at the famous Diet of Worms in 1521. To some extent, of course, he is a literary figure, famous for making the first important translation of the Bible in German, and he's also sort of a musical figure who collaborated on the writing of many important hymns. But when you consider literature in this age, one name clearly has to come to mind first: Shakespeare. Most would say he's simply the greatest dramatist ever. Racine's plays are rarely performed in public theaters, even in France. Goethe's Faust, sometimes called the single greatest play ever written, since it was written, has been given only one complete performance in the United States in the 2 centuries since it was written. But Shakespeare is the most popular playwright to this day in the English-speaking countries and is still widely performed all over the world. And then we'll hear about a lot of people who are just interesting personalities, like Henry VIII and Francis I and Queen Elizabeth here. And Queen Elizabeth ruled England through what can be considered the most exciting and creative period in its history, at least. So that should tell you a bit about the program for this quarter, and now we'll finally get right on to page 1. We're going to start in London, at the Tower of London, in fact. Now, even if you came to the lecture last quarter on the Italian Renaissance, you didn't hear much about England. I haven't talked much about England since the end of the series on the Middle Ages. The Age of Castles and Cathedrals, it was called, about 6 months ago. When I did last talk about England, we were dealing with Richard the Lionhearted and his bad brother John, though, and I know you've all heard of them. And I know you've all heard of William the Conqueror, with whom we also dealt in that series, and it was William who built the keep, and it was his great-great-great-grandson, Henry III, the son of bad King John, who built the inner wall of the Tower of London complex. The outer wall was built a bit later by his son, Edward I. What most people think of as the Tower of London is just the keep of the whole castle complex. No one lived in the keep. People lived, and the tower was a frequent royal residence in its early history, in the buildings around the walls. And some of those who lived here did not do so by choice. No matter what period in English history interests you, right up to the 20th century, there's some prisoner, some part of the tower of interest. This quarter we'll hear about Henry VI, probably killed in the Wakefield Tower, Edward V, probably killed in the Bloody Tower, Queen Elizabeth and Thomas More, who were imprisoned in the Bell Tower, Anne Boleyn imprisoned in the Queen's House, the Dudleys imprisoned in the Beauchamp Tower, Robert Devereux in the Devereux Tower, and the Duke of Clarence, who was drowned in a wine vat in the Bowyer Tower, to name a few. In the distance here now, you can see the Byward or Password Tower, which was built in Edward I's day, and the Bell Tower, the round one there in the distance on the right. Henry III is referred to by Dante in the Purgatorio as the simple monarch, and most historians agree he was not a very impressive presence. He took over at just the age of 9 and had two powerful handlers, William the Marshal and Hubert de Burgh, but even though he was to be nominally on the throne for 56 years, he never really got the hang of effective leadership and was constantly in trouble with his nobility. The barons had forced his father to sign the Magna Carta, of course, and then John died before the consequences of this were fully felt, and it was his son Henry then who had to deal with their raised expectations, as it were. You're standing here in what was at one time the moat of the castle. The Salt Tower here is, though restored, part of Henry's original wall. In 1264 there was a revolt against Henry, led by his own brother-in-law Simon de Montfort, and the king and his son Edward were defeated and captured at the Battle of Lewes, south of London, the next year. To try to firm up support for his position as sort of the Cromwell of the 13th century,
Simon summoned what is usually called the First Parliament,
properly so called perhaps, to meet, which would include 2 knights and 2 businessmen from each shire. They were tired of giving the king money for harebrained projects and wanted more say in how their money was spent. As Herb Caen once said, though, if they thought taxation without representation was bad, they ought to see it now with representation. This is the Westminster Chapter House now. Some think that Simon's Parliament met here in 1265 in the newly finished Westminster Chapter House. In any case, Parliament did meet here from the time of Edward III to the time of Henry VIII, in whose reign the definitive separation of what came to be known as the House of Commons from the House of Lords took place. The former, the Commons, going on to meet in the St. Stephen's Chapel in Westminster Palace.
In fact, however, these bodies did often meet in other venues depending on various circumstances.
Except for Westminster Hall, the palace burned up in 1834, and the 2 houses moved into new quarters in the Charles Barry reconstruction, which was itself then badly damaged in World War II.
Despite extensive restoration, the Chapter House would still be recognized by Henry III and Simon de Montfort. It still has its original floor upon which they walked. The vault is essentially in what is called the decorated Gothic style of the late 13th and 14th centuries. It's a variety of fan vaulting that you see here, but pretty much one of a kind as a vault because of the circular shape of the building.
In 1265, the same year that Simon's Parliament met, Henry's son Edward was helped to escape and defeated and killed Simon at the Battle of Evesham, southwest of Stratford. He then besieged Simon's son at Kenilworth, took that place, and killed him too. This is called the Wakefield Tower now, and in this part of the Tower of London, Henry III spent most of his time. It was, in effect, his residence. For the rest of his reign, Henry was pretty much a lame duck, everyone realizing that his son was a much more charismatic and promising authority figure. This is the interior now, as it's been reconstructed.
Back in 1187, Eleanor, the daughter of Henry II of England, and her husband Alfonso VIII of Castile, founded the famous abbey of Las Huelgas outside Burgos in northern Spain, and they were later buried here in the sarcophagi you see. In 1254, the future Edward I, the 15-year-old son of Henry III, went off to Las Huelgas to marry their 13-year-old daughter Eleanor of Castile, who would become a very popular English queen, and their marriage is usually regarded as having been one of the happier among English royalty.
And in 1270, while Henry was still nominally the king, Edward, by then 31, and Eleanor went on an adventure to Palestine, and the king died before they returned. Here's Henry's tomb in Westminster Abbey. One thing he should be remembered for is his building. In addition to the work done in his day at the Tower, he undertook the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey and added a lot to Windsor Castle, both of which we'll see next week. You should probably not take this for a good likeness, and I don't have a good picture of his son Edward either, but he probably looked something like this. This is the middle tower of the Tower of London complex, which was part of his additions. Like most of the Plantagenets, Edward was big and broad-shouldered, probably well over 6 feet, and was known as Longshanks. Some idea of his presence can be gotten from the story that tells how the Bishop of London, who owed him money, came quaking into his throne room one day, and when Edward stood up and glared at him, he dropped dead on the spot. In this picture you can see the moat that was dug in Edward's day, with the middle tower on the right, the west, and the byward or password tower on the left. Here you're looking at the byward tower, which is part of the outer wall that was essentially built in Edward's day. Some think the use of these round projecting towers is a product of Edward's observations of Crusader castles in Palestine. This part of the complex above Traitor's Gate is known as the St. Thomas Tower.
It's named after Thomas Becket, but he never actually lived in it.
In Henry III's day, this was the moat and the gate opened to the Thames. In this picture you see the Thames side of the St. Thomas Tower. C.K. Oman, the foremost English castleologist, says that the finest castles ever built were put up in the reign of Edward I. Allington, which is a good example of a castle of Edward I's day, was built south of London in Kent by a private citizen who obtained what was called a license to crenellate, sort of what we would call a building permit, I guess, to fortify his house. Technically, crenels are the open spaces between the merlons in a battlement. This was the home of the poet Thomas Wyatt in Henry VIII's day.
Edward I's Chancellor, Robert Bernal, was, like Becket, a commoner who rose through the church. His manor house, now a ruin, is near Shrewsbury. This is also one of the places where Parliament met several times in the late 13th century.
Another good example of such a thing is Stokesay Castle near the Welsh border, and this is sometimes called the oldest fortified house in England. It was built by a clothing manufacturer named Lawrence de Ludlow, sort of the R.H. Macy of his day. He's the sort of fellow who would have been invited to sit in Parliament as a bourgeois representative by the king. Edward had followed Simon's lead, in fact, in supporting a role for the Commons in government, and his so-called model parliament of 1295 and others he called up to 1307 helped establish important precedents for the way the English government would work in the future. In this picture you can see the 13th century Great Hall and the Keep, and the 16th century Gatehouse as it's called
at the left.
Politically, Edward focused more on Wales and Scotland than on France, and this was at least partly because this attention was forced on him. Here you see the Keep up closer now. The Welsh prince, Llewellyn ap Gruffydd, had become engaged to the daughter of Simon de Montfort, and he had refused to attend Edward's coronation. He made some excuse, probably not as honest as the famous one Oscar Wilde sent to a hostess whose party you wanted to avoid. I can't come, lie follows. Anyway, this made Edward angry, and the king had Llewellyn's fiancée arrested when she was trying to get from France to Wales to join him. We'll hear what happened next after the break.